In the midst of England, two roses no longer stood for beauty. One red rose belonged to Lancaster, one white rose belonged to York, and both grew from blood. This was not only a war for the throne, but the suicide of a royal bloodline. Those who shared Plantagenet blood turned their swords against their own kin. Castle gates were shut, church bells trembled, and nobles secretly changed sides. At the feast table there were vows of loyalty, but outside the battlefield waited with daggers of betrayal. A weak king left the court without direction inside a growing storm of power. A House of York rose upward, while a House of Lancaster silently waited for revenge. Battle after battle turned the green fields of England into a graveyard of nobles. But the darkest shadow lay inside the cold and silent Tower of London. Two young princes disappeared, leaving a question that has haunted history for centuries. Richard III took the throne, but that crown was covered with suspicion. Across the sea, Henry Tudor prepared to return as the final gamble of history. He had no mighty army, but he had ambition and the timing of history. Everything would end at Bosworth, where loyalty would be purchased with human lives. Richard charged into his final battle, determined to kill Henry with one fateful blow. But in the mud and the clash of steel, the Plantagenet dynasty began to fall. From that moment, England no longer belonged to the old roses. If you love wars that change the course of history, subscribe to the channel now. Because the story of the roses will prove that a crown always costs more than human blood. The Wars of the Roses began as a deep crack inside English royal power. It was not an invasion from outside, but a struggle to seize the crown from within. The two great factions were Lancaster and York, both descended from the Plantagenet royal line. Lancaster was remembered through the red rose, a symbol of the older claim to succession. York was remembered through the white rose, a symbol of new ambition. Behind those beautiful symbols waited blood, mud, and betrayal. The roots of the war lay in an England losing faith in the throne. After many failures beyond its shores, the English court became divided and unstable. The territories England once held in France slipped away one after another. The pride of earlier victories turned into political humiliation. Inside the palace, advisors argued over taxes, war, and power. Across the estates, nobles raised private forces and prepared for a day of upheaval. King Henry VI stood at the center of the historic moment. He carried Lancaster blood, but not the strength needed to control the court. His gentle nature made many believe the throne itself had become weak. When a king could not rule firmly, the great lords began to decide for themselves. England became a chessboard where every great family concealed a knife. A promise could become an alliance, then become betrayal by the next dawn. Richard, Duke of York, rose as the most dangerous rival to Lancaster. He also carried Plantagenet blood, so his claim could not be easily dismissed. To many, York seemed to offer a stronger order and a new source of power. To Lancaster, York was only a usurper exploiting royal weakness. From there, political conflict slid downward into open military confrontation. The meetings of nobles were no longer strong enough to hold the kingdom together. Feudal armies were summoned beneath the banners of powerful families. Men who once prayed together in church now faced one another on the field. The most dangerous truth was that both sides believed they were just. Lancaster defended the king on the throne and the existing order of succession. York argued that its bloodline gave it a stronger right to the crown. When both claims came from royal blood, the sword became the final judge. This was not only the story of one king and one challenger. It dragged dukes, earls, knights, soldiers, and innocent common people into its path. Each region chose a side through interest, loyalty, or fear. Some families changed sides to survive, while others died holding to their oath. Political marriages were calculated as carefully as military campaigns. A noble bride could carry inheritance, soldiers, and allies into a new alliance. One unexpected death could open the way for a new claim to the throne. So the war was not fought only with swords, spears, and bows. It was also fought with rumors, decrees, marriage contracts, and accusations. Ordinary people often could not understand the tangled disputes of royal blood. Yet they paid the price with harvests, homes, and lives. Armies passing through left crushed fields and deserted villages behind. To the common people, red rose or white rose could both mean sorrow. Still, the nobility kept wagering lives upon the crown. Each victory only drove the other side into shadow. It never ended hatred. A deposed king could return if old allies changed their minds. The winner of one day could become the hunted fugitive of the next. That constant reversal made the Wars of the Roses especially dangerous. It was not a short campaign, but a long sickness of the kingdom. That sickness consumed loyalty, law, and the sacred meaning of kingship. From St. Albans to Towton, the blood of English nobles flowed more heavily. Those battlefields warned that Plantagenet was cutting through its own roots. While Lancaster and York tore each other apart, another future quietly formed. At the edge of the war, the Tudors were not yet the ruling force. The exhaustion of the two Plantagenet branches would open the road for them. Henry Tudor would later appear not as the strongest man, but as the one who remained. That is why this war feels more like a family tragedy than a conquest. A great dynasty was not defeated by foreigners, but by its own ambition. When the crown lost its sacred power, England entered an age of blades. And from that crack, the Wars of the Roses erupted into a storm of history. The first flame of the Wars of the Roses erupted at St. Albans. This was where court disputes became real blood on the streets. Yorkist forces struck the men loyal to King Henry VI of Lancaster. That victory made the Duke of York the man controlling royal power. But one small victory could not heal the wound of an entire kingdom. Lancaster refused to let York control the king and the government. After St. Albans, hatred among the nobles grew deeper. The great lords prepared armies, as if peace were already an illusion. The Duke of York believed he held the greater right to the crown of England. The Lancastrian queen refused to let her son lose his inheritance. She became the fighting spirit of Lancaster when the king was too gentle to lead. From palace to battlefield, she drove loyal men to resist York. The conflict was no longer only a debate about royal succession. It had become a matter of life and death between two factions that could not coexist. At Wakefield, the Duke of York walked into a deadly trap. Lancastrian forces attacked fiercely and crushed York's army in the freezing season. The Duke of York fell, and his dream of wearing the crown ended in blood. His death did not weaken York, it turned them into a fire of revenge. His son Edward continued the cause with youth, strength, and fierce ambition. Edward wanted more than revenge. He wanted the crown itself. He gathered York's loyal men and marched toward supreme power. Towton became the most terrifying symbol of the entire war. In cold wind and white snow, two English armies rushed to kill one another. Longbows, war axes, and swords turned the field into a sea of death. There was no place for mercy when each side believed it defended justice. Towton ended with a decisive Yorkist victory and disaster for Lancaster. Edward took the throne and became Edward IV of York.
Huntsburg.
To many Yorkists, justice seemed to have been restored at last. To Lancaster, it was only a usurpation waiting to be reversed. Henry VI was pushed into shadow, while the Lancastrian queen kept searching for a counterattack. But Edward IV's power was never as secure as it appeared. He had to depend on powerful nobles to keep the throne he had won. Among them, the Earl of Warwick rose as the formidable kingmaker. Warwick helped Edward win, but his ambition did not end with loyalty. When Edward married against Warwick's plans, their alliance began to crack. The break between king and kingmaker opened a new cycle of betrayal. Warwick changed sides and joined Lancaster to overthrow the king he had once created. Edward was forced to leave England and seek refuge beyond its shores. For a brief time, Henry VI was placed back upon his old throne. Yet that return felt more like a ghost of the past than a living dynasty. Edward refused to accept exile as the final shape of his fate. He returned to England, gathered an army, and gambled everything on the battlefield. At Barnet, Edward faced Warwick in a battle of confusion and fog. The fog made soldiers mistake one another, and the Lancastrian alliance fell into deadly disorder. Warwick fell, and the legend of the Kingmaker ended in the dust of battle. The victory at Barnet gave Edward the initiative once again. Yet Lancaster still carried one great hope at Tewkesbury. There, the Queen's army and the Lancastrian heir faced Edward. Tewkesbury ended with a heavy Lancastrian defeat and the death of its heir. When the Lancastrian heir fell, the direct future of Henry's line was almost erased. Soon afterward, Henry VI also died in London under deeply suspicious circumstances. With that death, Edward seemed to have extinguished the Lancastrian flame. For several years, York ruled England with an appearance of stability. But the war had left wounds that could not be seen at once. Noble families were destroyed, estates changed hands, and loyalty became cheap. the people saw one army after another pass through their villages. The exact numbers of the dead are still debated by historians. What is certain is that the English nobility bled severely. York won many great battles, but it did not cure the disease of disputed kingship. Beneath Edward's crown, the seeds of the tragedy at Bosworth were already growing. After the victories of Edward IV, York seemed to control England. But that stability depended too much on one strong king. When Edward IV died, the crown became dangerous prey once more. His son was too young to defend royal power by himself. So Richard, Edward's brother, quickly stepped into the center of politics. At first, Richard appeared as protector of the young king. But within a short time, protection became the seizure of the crown. Two young princes were taken into the Tower of London and slowly vanished from public life. That disappearance became the greatest shadow over the reign of Richard III. No one can prove with certainty what happened behind those stone walls. But rumors spread through England faster than riders on horseback. To many people, Richard was no longer the protector of Yorkist power. He became a king suspected of stepping over children's blood to wear the crown. Even if the truth is still debated, Richard's political reputation was badly damaged. Henry carried Lancaster blood, but his claim to the throne was not especially strong. What he had was opportunity, patience, and the enemies Richard had created. Outside England, Henry searched for support from France and from exiled allies. France wanted pressure on England, so it supported Henry's dangerous gamble. Wales became the crucial gateway, because Henry's roots were tied to that land. When Henry landed in Wales, he was not yet certain to win. His army included exiles, mercenaries, and men dissatisfied with Richard. Step by step, the march turned him from challenger into a symbol of hope. Many families hesitated, watching to see who would hold the final fortune. In a civil war, waiting could be more dangerous than open betrayal. Richard gathered his army to stop Henry before the uprising could spread. He was still King of England, with the larger army and the visible claim of law. But Richard's problem was not only the number of soldiers on the field. The greater problem was that he could not be sure which nobles would die for him. The Battle of Bosworth took place on August 22nd, 1485. This was the decisive moment between the last Plantagenet king and the founder of Tudor power. On that field, England, Wales, and the influence of France met in one gamble. Richard's army stood stronger, but the whole field was covered in doubt. The Stanley forces held a key position, but their loyalty was not yet revealed. They waited, watched, and judged which side deserved the victory. Henry knew he could not win by direct military strength alone. He needed timing, terrain, and betrayal from those still hesitating. When the battle began, trumpets and steel tore through the morning air. Rows of spears moved forward, cavalry shifted, and dust hid the banners. Richard saw a chance to end everything by striking directly at Henry. It was a reckless decision, but it revealed the warrior inside him. If Henry died, the rebellion would lose its head and Tudor hopes could collapse. Richard led a furious charge through the chaos of the battlefield. He did not fight like a king behind the line, but like a knight searching for fate. In that moment, the Plantagenet crown was wagered on the force of one sword. But the battlefield no longer obeyed the personal courage of a medieval warrior. The Stanley forces finally intervened, tipping the balance toward Henry Tudor. Richard was isolated in the mud, fighting to the end amid shouting and steel. He died in battle, and with him, Plantagenet rule on England's throne ended. Bosworth cost fewer lives than Towton, but its meaning was far greater. About 1,000 men on Richard's side are believed to have fallen. Henry's side suffered far fewer losses, often estimated at around 100 men. But the most important number was not the dead soldiers, but the dead dynasty. After the victory, Henry Tudor was proclaimed Henry VII of England. Tudor became the winning house, gaining the crown, legitimacy, and political future. York lost its king, its central power, and its chance to hold the crown. Those loyal to Richard faced punishment, confiscated lands, and exile. To heal the country, Henry married Elizabeth of York after taking the throne. That marriage joined the symbols of Lancaster and York inside a new dynasty. From Bosworth, England stepped out of Plantagenet's shadow and into the Tudor age. The Wars of the Roses erupted because the English crown lost its sacred authority. When the king was weak, powerful lords began to treat authority like a prize of war. Lancaster and York both carried Plantagenet blood, which made the war even more tragic. This was not a war against outsiders, but a tragedy inside one royal family. Each side believed it had the stronger legal right to the English crown. That belief made compromise difficult, and the sword became the final answer. Defeat in France, financial crisis, and noble ambition cracked the kingdom apart. St. Albans, Towton, Barnet, Tewkesbury, and Bosworth were only the surface of the storm. Beneath them lay betrayal, political marriages, and oaths broken in the dark. York once seemed victorious when Edward IV held the throne. But his death opened a dangerous vacuum of power for Richard III. The disappearance of the two princes in the Tower destroyed trust in Richard. Henry Tudor used that moment to turn exile into royal destiny. At Bosworth, Richard died in battle, and Plantagenet lost the throne forever. Tudor won, but its victory came from more than the blade. Henry VII understood that marriage, symbols, and noble control mattered as much as armies. When he married Elizabeth of York, the two rival roses were bound into one dynasty. England then moved away from noble civil war and toward a more centralized crown. This war proved that a dynasty can die from its own blood. And from the ashes of the roses, English history entered the powerful Tudor age,